Welcome. I'm your host, Hillary Bricken, and this is the Cannabis Law Now podcast, where we regularly discuss issues related to the cannabis industry, including investment, day-to-day operational issues, and potential reform on the horizon that will impact all cannabis businesses and investors in the United States. Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast, where today we're going to be talking with Jennifer Morris, who is the Code Enforcement Administrative Manager for Riverside County, California, which is one of the biggest counties, not only in California, but in the United States of America. I had the real pleasure of being on a panel with Jennifer, basically for a big regional talk in California about land use, code enforcement, and planning, specifically focused on the cannabis industry because California is a heavy local control state. That's what voters wanted. And Jennifer's main job is to enforce code regulations at the county level for all types of cannabis licensees. So welcome to the podcast, Jennifer.
Thank you, Hillary. I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Right on. Okay, well, let's dive in. We were kind of talking before we started recording. You're my first enforcement person at any level that I've had on the podcast, which I think makes your interview pretty unique. Can you give us a little bit about your background, specifically in cannabis enforcement?
Yeah, sure. So I work for the County of Riverside. I'm in code enforcement. I've been in code enforcement for almost 18 years. I guess it was probably about 2013, I worked an area of the county that started to see a lot of backyard cannabis grows. And the first year that they came in, I think I had 3. And then the next year I had 30. And then the next year there was too many to count. So I was uniquely qualified because I was working in an area that had a really large amount of these illegal grows. And then in 2015, Riverside County passed the medical marijuana ordinance. Before that, we were a permissive county, we were a non-permissive county. We did not allow any industrial cannabis activities, no dispensaries, no grows, anything like that. We had a lot of illegal dispensaries. So before the 2015, I was involved in actually getting those closed from an ordinance standpoint as an unpermitted business. That's pretty much how we went about it. But in 2015, Riverside County passed Ordinance 925, which was our medical marijuana ordinance, which did allow for people to grow their own medicine. It put a cap on how many plants. It was 12 per person, no more than 2 people. And it had some other regulations. So in 2015, I started regulating that heavily in the area that I worked because we had a lot of people that were growing cannabis in their backyard. At the same time, I was also dealing with the illegal dispensaries that were in my area. And then in 2019, the County of Riverside passed the ordinance, and the voters voted in County of Riverside to allow commercial cannabis activities for the unincorporated areas. So in 2019, we added to our ordinance, which regulates businesses, to allow for industrial cannabis activities. And at that time, our county was forward-thinking, and they developed a cannabis enforcement team through the code enforcement department. Rather than criminalizing it, it's really a land use violation. Anymore, it's not a criminal act to have, cannabis growing. It's more of a land use public nuisance. We want to make sure that it's being grown in the right area. So we put the regulations on there, and I was the first supervisor for that team. I had a team of 4 at that time. And since then, we really flourished. I started it wasn't very local. I went for the whole entire state of California. It was a multi-jurisdictional meeting that we would meet on Zoom. And we would discuss a lot of it was all code enforcement departments. I think I had 43 jurisdictions that we would discuss, and we would discuss trends that we were seeing in our legal cannabis community that were coming in, moving in, helping those jurisdictions that were new to legal cannabis and helping those jurisdictions that are kind of being overran by the illegal cannabis that's coming up the illegal grows that they're finding in their community.
And I gotta say, I think it's really wise for local government to put together a local team that's dedicated to this initiative rather than charging maybe one or two existing staff members, piling on with their existing workload for cannabis because it's complicated. And we're going to get into some of those complications locally and kind of interacting with the state. But what was enforcement like locally at the outset of legalization in California, which 2016, everybody votes for it, but it wasn't until 2018 that licensing at the state level kicked off.
So I think that the best way to describe it is probably inconsistent. Everyone's doing a little differently in their jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions are hitting it hard. Some jurisdictions are really, embracing it. And those jurisdictions are the ones that I've actually learned a lot from. They're embracing that legal cannabis culture. They're really getting in there, they're learning, they're embracing it, making it part of their community. And then you have others who are still not allowing it in their jurisdiction. So they're kind of fighting this battle of trying to prevent it from leaking into their jurisdiction. So I think that it can be inconsistently addressed. But when you have inconsistencies like that, that could be related to a lot of things. It could be related to the fact of that area, needs more of like I know the desert areas out here in our county, they have a higher cannabis culture. They have a lot of cannabis culture that's ingrained. They have, Coachella comes in, and so they are embracing it more. And then you have Northern California, which has their own, troubles that they're trying to take care of. You have, it's a culture of cannabis that's been there for, 50 years, maybe a little less. And so they're trying to, do what's best for their community. So I think that at the onset, it was inconsistent, but it was also a really good time to learn. We learned a lot, what works, what doesn't. You learn who your players are. A lot of what we found in Riverside County was our illegal grows were probably tied to organized crime. We had a lot of labor trafficking, human trafficking that was labor trafficking, that they would bring in workers that were different countries, Vietnam, China, a lot of the Hmong community, and they would bring them here. They didn't speak English, and they would, work them, and that drug was leaving California. I know that they found that a lot of the outdoor grows that we were coming across, that drug was leaving California, and then it was actually leaving the United States, going to a lot of the Asian countries where, the penalties for possessing cannabis can be up to death. So they tracked a lot of it going to the shipping yards. A lot of it went to Minnesota. So it wasn't even staying in our community. When we first started working it, it was you had to learn a lot, because here you are trying to regulate something that's been kind of secretive for a while. So I learned a lot just by talking to the growers. Like, what are you using? Why are you using this? How is this being grown? Because they had to, for so many years, grow in secret. It was an industry that was out there, but it was pushed into the darkest corners. So in order to regulate it, you almost had to really learn from them. And as I learned, I found that, there was a lot of people that were in this, that were good people, but didn't have a legal way to do this activity.
And I've always thought of Riverside as kind of a tough, endearing community. And I don't think it's a secret that there was a lot of illegal activity and trafficking occurring, especially in those medical cannabis years leading up to legalization. So having said that, because you really had to sweep out some seriously bad actors, finding them, addressing the situation while promoting business development, I know that wasn't easy. So what's the hardest aspect of local enforcement, in your opinion?
The hardest thing that I came across was educating people, and your education was pushing against what they were hearing from the people telling them that this is legal. You can grow, you can do this. And I guess, you have two groups here. We had one group was the mom and pop growers. They own a piece of property. It's rural. It's, 5 acres. Somebody comes to them and they say, hey, we're going to give you $1,000, $10,000 at the end. All you have to do is grow. And then we would come and say, hey, you can't have this grow here. You can't have 2,000 plants on your property that is in the middle of a residential neighborhood. And they would say, well, the guy came and he told me it's legal. He said not to listen to you. And of course, the person that is going to be held accountable is the property owner. The person growing comes in the middle of the night and they harvest and they take their plants and they leave. And the property owner is stuck with this bill because we brought in legal, we would get legal orders. We would come and cut it ourselves. And so I felt like there was a lot of victimization of property owners from people that were trying to, make a quick buck and use them as a shield for their illegal activities. It's not something that you were going to go to jail for, but it is something that monetarily really will affect the property owner. The laws are on our side for a nuisance property owner. Used a lot of case law for slumlords. A slumlord doesn't have to be aware of the actual conditions on the ground, but they're still responsible. So we would have a lot of owners that were out of state that people would just start growing on their property. Or we would have owners that an illegal dispensary would be occupying their space. And then the illegal dispensary would be telling them, oh, just pretend like you're evicting us and just keep giving us extensions. Or they're lying to you. They're not going to take you to court. And then we have to go to court. We have to get the temporary restraining order. We're going in there and doing a lockout. And at the end, the owner is stuck with a $30,000 bill because now civil penalties have come in. And so there was a lot of just misinformation. So you're constantly fighting that misinformation against, to try to protect the property owner. And they don't believe you. They believe the other people that are victimizing them in the end.
I think there's a lot of hope, right, that the county wouldn't bother, they wouldn't expend the taxpayer dollars, but the law is definitely on your side. And especially for emergency relief, these things can move really quickly. It's not unusual, right, for local governments to use property owners essentially as the hammer and a means to an end to get rid of the illegal activity. And I've seen that used in Los Angeles and other cities, even outside of the state of California. What's the easiest aspect of enforcement, pivoting away from kind of the hardest?
Annie Ellie and I were discussing this earlier. I think that the easiest is also education. It is really good to be able to educate people and allow them to grow their medicine, their cannabis legally. So when you come to a property owner and they're like, well, I need this. I have arthritis. I can't afford it. Yes, great. Let me help you. Let me talk to you about the 6 recreational plants that you can have. Let me talk to you about the 12 cannabis, medicinal plants that you can have. Let me help you get that. And also, too, one of the great things, too, is now that we allow for legal dispensaries in our county, it has just been great to go there and see them taking the regulations so seriously and see them really thriving and having a robust business. I mean, I think that to me has been exciting. Maybe it's not the easiest, but it's been super exciting to me to go from one realm of where I was surrounded and all I saw was illegal dispensaries. And when you go into an illegal dispensary, they're dusty, they're dirty, they selling, product that is, maybe like not the safest. And when you've been in illegal grows and you see, dead animals around and that they've used some type of rodenticide, carbofuran, and you see that, how things are, you really start to appreciate the clean operations, the cleanliness that I see in legal dispensaries, the cleanliness that I see in legal grows, the care that they take for the consumer, knowing that somebody's going to be consuming this. It took me to a different mindset. I was a mindset of let's, take down the illegal ones And my mindset completely changed to, oh my gosh, we have to do everything in our power to help them succeed, because people have spoken, they want this. And now you see that, what it being done in a legal fashion means. And that's something that I had not seen. So the easiest transition to me, it was like almost like overnight when I saw the legal industry. Overnight, it completely changed my mindset.
And it really is a partnership between local government and these types of licensees and cannabis, maybe opposed to or contrasted with some other industries because it is so highly regulated. And because of the way our laws are set up, specifically in California, the local control is such a heavy hand. So it really is a partnership, at least in my mind, as a lawyer in the industry. And having said that, do you find in your enforcement efforts that cannabis licensees are mostly law-abiding? They're easy to talk to, they're receptive of these education campaigns, especially if there's a change in the law?
Absolutely. The cannabis industry, the legal cannabis industry, like I just said earlier, they really changed my mindset. I mean, they're wanting to, of course, have their business succeed, but they're also under heavy pressure from different agencies, regulating on the state, the local government. So I understand it's really hard, but they come to us and they're very receptive. We did in the very beginning, we had one dispensary that was, that was a little bit more difficult. I kind of, in hindsight, think that perhaps that one had been maybe one that had operated, not that specific one, but maybe the players had operated in the illegal industry. So they themselves had to learn to trust us, because, they were having events, they were having things and not coming to us and letting us, do like a temporary event permit. And so we kind of were like very heavy handed in the beginning. And then the first 420, we went out and I could see other jurisdictions, the city jurisdictions, their dispensaries were having kind of these big events and ours weren't having anything because, they were kind of scared to come to us and ask. So we had to do a lot of education campaign to the dispensaries, really reaching out. Hey, educate us. What do you need? Like, what does a 420 look like for a legal dispensary? Well, we might have like a DJ, we might have like a food truck. Great. We want you to be able to bring in your customers, but you have to trust us and you have to give us your game plan of what you're going to do. And I actually learned a lot from them. For example, we have one of our ordinances is there's no on-site consumption. And I think that's kind of a common thing. I know that they're moving towards lounges, which is great. And if that ends up coming to Riverside County, we'll regulate it. But right now we don't allow that. And so we had one dispensary that had a vendor come in and they were doing the drinks. So we see them advertising on Instagram, that they have this vendor there. And we're like, aha, on-site consumption. You're not allowed to do that. Go out there. Well, we find out that what they're consuming does not have THC in it. But it opened up a question for us, like, okay, what does it mean? They're bringing in vendors. We had like no vendors. Well, I don't know that we actually had no vendors law, but we didn't understand what it meant for a vendor to come in. We believed, they're going to be like passing out samples, like when you go to Costco. So we had to be educated from the dispensary. No, that doesn't mean that. So we softened our approach because we were very like heavy handed, you can't do this, you can't have a DJ in there. And now we're just like, nah, they're having a DJ. We have to understand the industry and be business friendly. We want to be business friendly. So we learned a lot. I learned just as much as they learned. So the trust that we have worked to build with our legal industry here in Riverside County has been, I think, for me, one of the most important the trust that we want to build between our government, planning, code enforcement, and be partnering with the legal industry has been huge. And I think we've made a lot of strides.
And what do you think for regulators who are listening or regulators that are maybe struggling to deal with this on the local level? Because when you and I were in Riverside together on that code enforcement panel, there were lots of questions about how to do this at the local level because it's still so new, even if it is seemingly old for legalization happening in California back in 96. But for many states that are coming online where local control is going to come into play, what do you think the best local mechanism is to achieve positive results with licensees? Is it permitting? Is it zoning? Is it land use? Is it licensing? Is it a development agreement? What's the one thing that you would recommend to local regulators that might be listening? And for cannabis licensees that are listening, what can they expect?
So in Riverside County, it looks a little different. We do a development agreement. We are not taking taxes from your sales. We take taxes from the sales floor. That's the route we chose. We are not heavy oversight. We approve you. We go out once a year. We're not tapping into your cameras. But I think that I might not be the best person to answer this because I just know what's working here in Riverside County. I know that in some of the cities, they have a much heavier oversight. They have actual teams. They will go and look at your point of sale system. They look at your metric system, which in California, I know this is probably nationwide, but in California, the metric system is the point of sale system. It's the seed to the consumption system where you can track that plant from the moment it's grown to the moment it's sold to the consumer. That's something in Riverside County that we're not really heavily doing. We try to get out in front and do our development agreement to really address what we envision this business to be looking like in 2 years and in 10 years. And we understand that it may change. We go back in, we can change the development agreement as the industry is changing. But I have to say that for a long time, we fought it. I would say, this is just Jennifer person speaking, it's a losing battle to fight the illegal industry. What really helped us was when we legalized it in Riverside County. The minute that it was legalized in Riverside County, it was a lot easier for us to battle the players that were bringing the illegal industry in because a lot of the courts don't understand. They're like, well, I thought cannabis was legal. And we're like, you're right, it is. And it's much easier when you're explaining we have a path to compliance. We have a permitting program. So this person has just chosen not to get a permit. But I also noticed that once we started down that road of having legal dispensaries, our illegal dispensaries fell by the wayside. They weren't there anymore. And it was very important for the County of Riverside. I was also on the District Attorney's Cannabis Regulation Task Force. And what we dealt with on the Cannabis Regulation Task Force was unfair business practices. And that's kind of been my stance going forward, especially now that it's legal in Riverside County. I want to make sure that I take away any unfair business practices that will affect the legal cannabis dispensaries, their sales. So the district attorney's team, that's all we dealt with. We just dealt with the illegal dispensaries that were trying to undersell the legal dispensary that was, any new business that takes off in your jurisdiction, it's going to have a time where they're kind of maybe struggling, they're learning, it's not always easy to get off the ground. There's a lot of competition in the cannabis industry. So I want that competition never to come from an illegal cannabis dispensary or an illegal cannabis grow. So we took it very seriously. We did a lot of court actions, a lot of civil court actions. I think if you're looking for those jurisdictions, what the best thing to do is permitting them. At the end of the day, if it's coming, when you permit them, then you can regulate them. It's really hard to regulate something that's illegal. The only way to regulate it is to, abate it. And if it's legal, then you can actually create a program which works best for your community.
Got it. And kind of pivoting, it's a little bit of a segue talking about undermining and competition. How has it been regulating or enforcing around industrial hemp in the county, right? Because California, we did an interesting thing, which was happening when you and I last saw each other, where they've banned all intoxicating hemp products, basically. That is the intent and the effect. How's it been on the local level in Riverside since it's such a huge place relative to industrial hemp?
So industrial hemp has been a big thing for us to regulate. Back in 2019, 2021, Riverside County had the most hemp registrants. I think we had 170. The way it went under the Right to Farm Act is you could just come into our agricultural commissioner's office who acted on behalf of the state. You can get $1,000 permit and you could grow hemp. We started realizing very quickly that they were not growing hemp. They were growing clandestine cannabis. So we started hitting those people very hard. We would go out, we did sample warrants where we got a warrant to come out and sample the cannabis that you had on your property and go test it to see if it had the right amount of THC. And shockingly, we did 7 of them and they all came in at recreational levels, 12%. Then they started doing mother plants. And then shockingly, we didn't realize at first that we could test the mother plants. So they said, oh, these are hemp mother plants. And they would have, 1,000, and they were actual mother plants. And so then we realized we could actually test the mother plants. So we would test the mother plants and they would come back with 3% THC. It's not budded, but a plant that's in a vegetative state, still throwing up 3% THC, that when that plant goes into bud or it goes into its life cycle, it's going to come out, much higher. So we know then that those are not hemp. So now what Riverside County is dealing with is we're dealing with these consumable hemp products, Delta 8. They're being sold at our smoke shops. We have smoke shops we have one smoke shop that was an illegal smoke shop that was right next door to a legal cannabis dispensary. They're selling Delta 8. Of course, somebody who is under 21, it's not regulated. Anybody can walk in there and they can buy that Delta 8. And I view that as also unfair business practices against the cannabis industry, against our legal cannabis dispensary. So we're closing that loophole. What we're doing now is we're starting small. It's not small, but we're making sure that all of our smoke shops are permitted. They're licensed. Are they in the correct area? Are they selling too close to a dispensary? They can sell their glassware, they can sell their tobacco and things like that. But we did an industrial hemp ordinance. We made it so that if you want to grow industrial hemp in the county of Riverside, there's a whole litany of things that you have to do. You have property sizes, it must be this big. You must have setbacks. Another thing that we said, you must have electricity. That was actually a big one. A lot of these people are wanting to grow out very secretive locations, so they have no electricity. They can't do industrial generators, no generators allowed. And so we regulated it. We started with like 150, 175. We're down to like 3. Because once we started regulating it heavily, we're saying these are the parameters, and we just use land use regulations. Like, hey, you want to grow? This is how you grow. Certain properties would have to get a conditional use permit. Certain properties, we called it the golden ticket. You didn't have to get a conditional use permit, but it must fall within these parameters. So the people that were growing illegal cannabis, and disguising it as hemp, they had to move on and find another way of doing it. And now I think we have 4 to 7, and none of them are even really growing. So.
Got it. Okay. I want to talk about the state really quickly because sometimes there can be jurisdiction friction between the state and the locals about what occurs in a given jurisdiction. How has it been in Riverside dealing with the State Department of Cannabis Control? And, what's that dynamic like for local regulators? Because I think local regulators sometimes think the state will save us, right? They'll have enough barriers to entry. This is going to be a no-brainer. And 9 times out of 10, that is not the case. The locals are picking up the slack in my experience.
I have some friends that work in the state, so I hope they're not listening, but I can tell you that the state has been non-existent at times. Yes, we work closely when we do eradications on illegal grows with Fish and Wildlife. They have the whole EPIC grant, which is Fish and Wildlife, us, our local law enforcement. But I think that the state has not been very supportive in the illegal cannabis arena. They do, like I said, they do have Fish and Wildlife, but there is a lot more that they could have done or they could be doing to help us out. I do know that when I was on the district attorney's team, we had to go out and actually close down a dispensary because the state revoked their license. And so you have to have the state license in order to have the dispensary in that jurisdiction, of course. And the state revoked the license. But when the jurisdiction asked, hey, can you come out and close them down? They're like, yeah, that's kind of on you. And they did not have the ability of doing that. And because the district attorney had a law enforcement team that could go out because it required law enforcement, it's like a lockout, and the state was nowhere to be seen. I know that at that point, I came back to our powers that be, our planners, and I said, listen, we have to have a strategy because now that we're going to be legalizing, what does it look like to go into these establishments? How will we close them down? How are we going to have a revocation process? Because if we're going to depend on the state, we're not going to be able to effectively close them down. We're going to end up in a situation where you have someone who was a good player, loses their licensure, and then they just keep operating. And now we have another illegal dispensary. So that was very eye-opening for us. I was very appreciative to have actually had that opportunity to see how what it's going to look like when you have somebody that you need to close down because they have no state license. We have a plan, but I think that the state for many years did not support the local jurisdictions. They made a really big department with not a lot of people. And I think that they've taken a few knocks for it. And I think they're trying to reverse what the damage had been done or maybe the bad publicity. But I think that at the end of the day, I think that they're a very important piece of the process at the local jurisdiction in support, the licensure and actually regulating. I know that I've heard some things about them wanting us to do some processes that are actually at the state level, using their metric system, checking to make sure that plant came from where it was supposed to. And so there is some discussions on whose job is this? The state takes the money for the permits just the same as us. Who regulates it? And having both of us regulate or having them regulate where we can't would be, really helpful.
Yeah, I think that that's a common issue in these local control jurisdictions. And there are some states where they don't require local approval beforehand. You're free to get it after the fact. And if you have beef with your city or your county, that's on you as the licensee. You'll still get the state license. In California, that's not the case. And typically it's not the case. That would be an outlier. But again, partnerships all around, I think, is really the ideal. So my last question for you, because we just had a presidential election, we're going to have a second Trump presidency. Nobody really knows yet what that means for the cannabis industry or these democratic experiments, but people are pretty convinced, for right or wrong, that the feds will remain entirely hands-off. And my question to you as a local regulator, and you don't have to reveal anything, but just based on your experience, is it your opinion that local government is talking to federal government and state government about these licensees and activities in their jurisdictions? Because in my experience, if there was ever a bad actor and the feds came in, it was usually because the local government took strides to talk to the feds and maybe not the state. What have you seen in the field?
So I can tell you that I myself have never talked to anyone from the federal government. We had one issue that the federal government remained out of, and this was actually under the Trump presidency, which was we had some growing or dispensaries that were on sovereign nation like Indian land on reservations, which the federal government, regulates. At that time, they were not interested. They had no interest in, regulating it or doing anything about it. We still have that. We have a lot of tribal land that's out in the desert area. So I foresee, and I'm not any kind of, person that has enough education with the federal government to know, but I think that things are probably going to be pretty much the same. I can tell you in Riverside County, we have dealt with the state a little bit, but not much, and the federal government not at all.
Good to know. Okay, Jennifer, thank you so much for your time. We're all better off for having heard your take on local enforcement, and we really appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
And that concludes today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Until next time, stay alert, stay alive.